The headlines are everywhere. Trump and Zelensky clash in heated meeting. Social media is buzzing about Trump telling the Ukrainian president he's ungrateful and that Ukraine doesn't have the cards anymore. Some are calling it diplomatic disaster, others a necessary reality check. But what if I told you this controversial meeting wasn't just another Trump moment, but part of a centuries-old American tradition? Behind the drama lies a consistent thread of America First diplomacy that has shaped U.S. foreign policy since the founding of our nation. Today, we're diving deep into why Zelensky never stood a chance against Trump's playbook, a playbook written by 3 American presidents long before Trump entered politics. We'll explore how Teddy Roosevelt's big stick, Andrew Jackson's populist defiance, and Ronald Reagan's pragmatic toughness all set precedents for Trump's approach to Ukraine. By the end of this video, you'll see this controversial meeting through the lens of American history and understand why Zelensky was fighting against not just Trump, but 200 years of American diplomatic tradition. Before we dive into our presidential parallels, let's set the stage. The concept of America First didn't start with Trump's 2016 campaign. It dates back to George Washington's farewell address, where he warned against entangling alliances with foreign nations. Throughout American history, there's been a constant tension between idealism and pragmatism in foreign policy. Do we act as the world's policeman, defending democracy everywhere? Or do we focus primarily on direct American interests? This tension has defined American diplomacy for over 200 years, swinging like a pendulum between internationalist presidents like Woodrow Wilson and FDR, and more nationalist leaders like Calvin Coolidge and Trump. The recent Trump-Zelensky meeting represents the latest chapter in this ongoing debate. Zelensky entered this meeting hoping for continued American support, but he was walking into a room with ghosts of American presidents past, all of whom would have recognized Trump's approach immediately. Let's look at 3 presidents who embodied the America First approach long before it became a campaign slogan, and why their legacy made Zelensky's position nearly impossible from the start. First up, Theodore Roosevelt, America's rough-riding 26th president. TR wasn't just known for his mustache and big game hunting. He revolutionized American foreign policy with his famous maxim, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." In 1905, while Russia and Japan were locked in a bloody war that threatened American interests in Asia, Roosevelt didn't just send diplomatic notes or offer unconditional aid. He demanded both countries come to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to negotiate on American soil, under American terms. He didn't hide his leverage, America's rising naval power and economic might, but used it deliberately to shape an outcome favorable to U.S. interests. Roosevelt's approach wasn't about charity or idealism. He expected concrete results and, yes, gratitude for American involvement. When Japan tried to push for more concessions during the negotiations, TR firmly shut them down, reminding them of America's position of strength. When Trump met with Zelensky and reportedly said, "We've given you nearly $200 billion," he was following Roosevelt's playbook, demanding accountability for American generosity. Turkey would have recognized this transactional approach immediately. Roosevelt also pioneered what he called preventive intervention, the idea that America should resolve conflicts before they threatened wider stability. His famous Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine asserted America's right to intervene in Latin American affairs to prevent European powers from doing so. This America as referee approach mirrors Trump's push for a Ukraine-Russia ceasefire, an attempt to resolve a conflict before it further destabilizes Europe. Fun fact, Roosevelt became the first American to win a Nobel Peace Prize for his tough love diplomacy in the Russo-Japanese War. But here's the irony. Japan, The country he helped in those negotiations later bombed Pearl Harbor. It's a reminder that even successful foreign policy can have unexpected consequences decades later. Just as Roosevelt used America's rising power to shape global events on American terms, Trump leveraged America's economic and military might to pressure Ukraine toward a resolution with Russia. Different century, same strategy, and Zelensky found himself facing the same diplomatic pressure that foreign leaders encountered with Roosevelt over a century ago. Next up, Andrew Jackson, the controversial seventh president whose face adorns the $20 bill. Jackson was the original outsider president, a rough-edged populist who claimed to represent ordinary Americans against corrupt elites and foreign influences. Jackson rose to fame as a military hero who defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. But his presidency was defined by his fierce defense of what he called the common man against powerful institutions. When Jackson thought the National Bank was hurting regular Americans, he didn't politely disagree. He destroyed it completely, vetoing its recharter and withdrawing federal deposits. His opponents in Congress and the press called him King Andrew, a tyrant and a dictator who trampled constitutional norms. The political establishment was horrified by his blunt, confrontational style. Jackson's approach to foreign policy was equally direct. He didn't care about diplomatic niceties if they conflicted with what he saw as American interests. In his view, America didn't need to apologize for pursuing its own advantage. He famously ignored a Supreme Court ruling to protect Native American lands, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This willingness to defy established institutions when they conflicted with his vision of America's interests is strikingly similar to Trump's approach. When Trump abruptly canceled the planned press conference with Zelensky and later criticized him on social media, he was channeling pure Jacksonian energy, putting perceived American interests above diplomatic protocols. Jackson also pioneered the use of direct communication with the American people, bypassing traditional media of his day. He used newspapers loyal to him to speak directly to voters, an early 19th century version of Trump's use of social media to communicate his unfiltered thoughts on Ukraine. Fun fact, it's no coincidence Trump chose Jackson's portrait as one of the first decorations in his Oval Office. Both men positioned themselves as disruptors fighting against an entrenched system. Both faced intense criticism for their blunt style, and both prioritized what they called the forgotten Americans over international obligations. Jackson's legacy is deeply complicated. He expanded democracy for white men while brutally removing Native Americans from their lands in the Trail of Tears. But his America First approach to governance created a template that Trump consciously followed in his dealings with Ukraine and other nations. Zelensky, trained in the diplomatic norms of the 21st century, was unprepared for this Jacksonian approach that prioritizes domestic interests over international protocols. Our third presidential parallel, Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood actor turned Cold Warrior. During the 1980s, Reagan dramatically increased military spending while simultaneously demanding NATO allies pay more for their own defense. His message to Europe was clear: America will protect you, but you need to contribute your fair share. Does that sound familiar? It should. Trump's constant criticism of NATO spending and his pressure on Ukraine to be more grateful for American aid comes straight from Reagan's playbook. When Reagan took office in 1981, he inherited a military weakened by post-Vietnam cuts and a Soviet Union expanding its influence globally. Rather than continuing the policy of détente or relaxed tensions, Reagan took a confrontational approach, calling the USSR an evil empire and launching a massive military buildup. European allies were initially horrified, They feared Reagan would start World War III with his tough rhetoric. Massive protests erupted across Europe when Reagan deployed new missiles to counter Soviet weapons. Sound familiar to the criticism Trump received for his approach to Ukraine. But Reagan combined this toughness with pragmatic deal-making. By his second term, he was negotiating major arms reduction treaties with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. His philosophy: trust but verify, a phrase he repeated so often, drove Soviet translators crazy. This combination of strength and pragmatism defined Reagan's foreign policy. He wasn't interested in endless conflicts or open-ended commitments. He wanted concrete results that benefited America, just like Trump's push for a resolution in Ukraine. Reagan also wasn't afraid to make difficult decisions that upset allies. In 1986, he bombed Libya despite strong opposition from European partners. His message was clear: America would act in its own interests, even if allies disagreed. This mirrors Trump's willingness to push Ukraine toward a ceasefire, even when some European nations prefer continued resistance to Russia. Fun fact: Reagan was widely portrayed as dangerous and reckless by the media of his time. Critics feared his confrontational approach would lead to nuclear war. Instead, his strategy of negotiating from strength helped end the Cold War without firing a shot. It's a reminder that controversial approaches to foreign policy sometimes yield unexpected results. Like Reagan, Trump's approach to Ukraine combines skepticism of open-ended commitments with a willingness to negotiate pragmatic solutions, even if those solutions aren't what Ukraine ideally wants. Zelensky, hoping for unconditional support, instead encountered Reagan's trust but verify approach, reincarnated in Trump's demands for accountability. So what really happened in that heated Trump-Zelensky meeting? Through our historical lens, it makes perfect sense why Zelensky never stood a chance. According to reports, the meeting quickly became tense when Trump questioned the ongoing U.S. support for Ukraine. "You're not going to get any more money," Trump reportedly told Zelensky. "You don't have the cards anymore." This wasn't just Trump being blunt. It was him channeling Teddy Roosevelt's pragmatic assessment of power dynamics. TR would have made the same calculation. Ukraine's position has weakened, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. Roosevelt believed in seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. When Trump pushed for Ukraine to make peace with Russia, even if it means giving up territory, he was following Reagan's practical approach to ending costly conflicts. Reagan understood that perfect solutions rarely exist in geopolitics. His negotiations with the Soviet Union weren't about achieving total victory, but finding acceptable compromises that served American interests. And when Trump demanded more gratitude for America's massive financial support, pure Andrew Jackson, the belief that America's interests should always come first, and that foreign aid isn't charity, but an investment that should yield returns. Jackson would have immediately understood Trump's frustration with what he perceived as ingratitude. The meeting reportedly escalated when Vice President J.D. Vance joined in, criticizing Zelensky for what he called a lack of respect for American support. This tag-team approach mirrors how Jackson would deploy his cabinet members to reinforce his messages. The canceled press conference and subsequent social media criticism, a modern version of Jackson's dismissal of diplomatic norms when they conflicted with his vision of American interests. Jackson frequently bypassed traditional channels to speak directly to the American people, just as Trump did by taking to social media after the meeting. Even the physical setting matters. Trump chose to meet Zelensky at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, not in Washington. This echoes Roosevelt's decision to host the Russo-Japanese peace talks in Portsmouth rather than Washington, establishing American control over the environment and terms of discussion. Zelensky, trained in the diplomatic protocols of international institutions and multilateral cooperation, was walking into a room with the ghosts of Roosevelt, Jackson, and Reagan, three presidents who prioritized American interests above all else. He never stood a chance against this deeply rooted American approach. The criticism Trump received for his handling of the Zelensky meeting also has historical parallels. Roosevelt was accused of being a warmonger and imperialist for his interventionist policies. Jackson was denounced as a tyrant, trampling constitutional norms. Reagan was portrayed as a dangerous cowboy who might start World War III. Yet history has been kinder to these presidents than their contemporary critics were. Roosevelt is now ranked among our greatest presidents, credited with establishing America as a world power. Jackson, despite his deeply problematic policies toward Native Americans, is recognized for expanding democratic participation. Reagan is credited by many historians with helping to end the Cold War through his combination of strength and diplomacy. This doesn't mean Trump's approach to Ukraine is necessarily correct. That judgment belongs to history and to voters. But it does suggest we should view his America First diplomacy not as an aberration, but as part of a recurring pattern in American foreign policy that has deep historical roots. Zelensky, like many foreign leaders before him, encountered not just a single president, but the weight of American diplomatic tradition, a tradition that has often prioritized American interests over international consensus. So why did Zelensky never stand a chance against Trump's playbook? Because it wasn't just Trump's playbook, it was America's. From Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy to Jackson's populist nationalism to Reagan's tough but practical approach to adversaries, Trump's handling of Ukraine follows a well-established American tradition that foreign leaders have struggled against for centuries. This doesn't mean the approach is right or wrong. That's for you to decide. But understanding the historical context helps us see beyond the headlines to the deeper patterns of American foreign policy. The pendulum of American diplomacy has always swung between idealism and pragmatism, between global engagement and national focus. Trump's approach represents one side of this ongoing tension, a side with deep roots in American history. Zelensky, hoping for the idealistic side of American foreign policy, instead encountered its pragmatic tradition. What do you think? Was Trump channeling Roosevelt, Jackson, Reagan, or creating his own playbook? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this historical perspective on current events, hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden history behind today's headlines.